As we go along, I will be posting a few polls, and I'm just gonna start with one of them right here. How do you actually feel about the ads that your brand is putting out? So there are 3 different options here. They could be a lot better. They're okay, and they're spot on. It's just to test out how this is working. So I hope you can figure out how to make a vote. You'll do it just above the chat. And I see that we actually got hold of Dan. So give me 2 seconds here. Dan, welcome.
Thank you.
So you're calling in from Stratford?
That's right. Stratford-on-Avon, the birthplace of William Shakespeare. That's what I usually tell people.
Yeah, that's nice. So I've been to Stratford many times because the direct line to London in most cases goes through your airport. But my trip or experience of Stratford is mostly from the plane directly to the train and then into London.
Yeah, you're missing out. It's a beautiful place.
Yeah, that's perfect. So I can see that now that you've actually joined us, you can maybe talk us through the 3 principles we're going through today.
Absolutely, yeah, thanks. So the 3 principles that Christopher and I will be talking to you about today are, firstly, being clear on the role of your communications. The second one is choosing the right media combinations. And the third one is optimizing your creative so that it is highly effective in diverse types of media.
Perfect. So I can see we just got the results in here. I'm just going to close the poll and pull out the results here. Give me 2 seconds. Yeah, so I can see that most people think that their ads are okay. There's not that many that are the architects, I guess, or maybe they're just finding that they're not that good. At least they could maybe be a little bit better. Anyways, just to give an idea about who we actually have here today, the next poll is just a bit on how big your advertisement budget is. So while Dan starts talking about the first principle, I'll just run the poll in just behind. Let me just start it here. So here you go. There's 4 different options. And then I'll let you take the word.
Okay, great. Yeah. So the first principle, as I said, was being clear on the role of communications. And of course, this varies considerably depending on the circumstances of the business and the brand. So think about some of the big factors shown here. Let's start at the bottom. Obviously, whether you even need communications and advertising will depend on your growth objectives for your company and for your brand. Then moving up, the role that you need the communications to play will depend heavily on the category, whether it's a high interest category or a low interest category, and also how strong the competition is. And then moving to the top, the other thing that influences the role of comms is the brand itself. So in particular, what you deliver as a brand, but also how established you are as a brand. Okay. So let me just zoom in on the 2 factors on the left in a little bit more detail. Imagine you are a brand in the top right of this matrix. In other words, you're a brand that delivers an exceptionally strong user experience, if you're lucky enough to do that, and you're in a category that people really care about. It's a high interest category. So just stop for a second and think about, what would you say is the role of communications in that circumstance? Well, according to Elon Musk, you don't really need much advertising at all if you're lucky enough to be in that situation. And in fact, the role of marketing is more about making it easy for people to experience that great user experience, and marketing to help facilitate the spreading of the word of mouth, the advocacy, because you've got such an interesting category and strong brand. But then if you consider, for example, the opposite end of the spectrum, that's a brand in the bottom left, where it's effectively you're talking about a fairly dull, ordinary sort of brand in a boring product category. Then the role that advertising plays is really a lot harder, in fact. And you're going to need to really showcase the brand and put it in its very best light. and you can't rely on things like advocacy and etc. and enthusiasm of people, because it just isn't there for that sort of category. And of course, this has big implications for the kind of media, the sorts of media that you should be using. So, for example, if you think about Tesla, so that was the brand at the top right. What's crucial for them is to get people to sit in those cars and to experience them and give them a test drive, etc. So things like the showrooms that they have in shopping malls, really important to them, because it gets that excitement, it gets the user experience that then generates lots of earned media, positive word of mouth, etc., etc. On the other hand, you think about the brand in the bottom left. Really, here you're going to have to use paid media. You're going to have to pay in order to generate interest in your brand. So you can see different sort of media, and I've also illustrated some of the other media that might be appropriate for the other two boxes as well. So I'm now going to hand over to Christopher to talk in a bit more detail about paid media, and in particular how the brand circumstances affect media choices.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dan. First of all, I want to say I think it's perhaps a bit rich of Elon Musk to say that you don't need advertising. I mean, when you can just put on a Tesla Roadster onto a spaceship and shoot into space, I mean, perhaps it's not really what most brands can afford, at least. So I think you can still say they do some sort of publicity, even though it's not.
You're right.
What we would call advertising normally.
Well, it still is advertising in a way. I mean, Elon Musk's Twitter channel is a fantastic free advertising vehicle for the brand. But I guess you could say he's earned that through the product he's produced has helped him give him that sort of status. But
yeah, sure. Okay, so when we talk about the different types of media strategies and how they relate to the role that your brand has in society or in the users' lives, one of the important questions to ask yourself is, are you really interesting, first of all, not just from your own perspective as a brand manager, but do you really believe that consumers care about your brand? And will they be interested in the message that you're going to tell them? Or is it something that they have? You can also put it like this. Is it something that they've heard before and that you think they will like? Or is it something completely new to them? So starting in the left, if people are not really aware of you or they don't really care about you, the objective of your media is to create the biggest impact you can. Well, basically, that's always the objective. But when you are in this situation, basically people just need to hear about it. You just need to scream as loud as you can, in a way. You just need to say "silly bang, silly bang, silly bang," or whatever it is. And so when you are in this situation, the types of media you would use would often be media that have sound on, media that people can't really skip, or huge impact formats in out of home, for example. So moving to the right, if you're not only interested in just screaming out your name and getting people to remember you, you could be in the build category or in the build tactic. And when you are here is when you want to establish new associations with your brand. So this is the category that you would often use for, let's call it, brand building. I know Dan will get more into that later. So when you are in this category, it's all about creating an emotional connection with the users. And for this, I would say you also need sound and you need audio visuals. So this is not the place for banner ads. This is the place for these huge, long, beautiful campaign videos, commercials that you have and that you can show in the cinema, that you can show in TV, in these kinds of big screens. So moving further along into what we call the explain category. This is where you have a quite complex message and you need some more time with the users in order to become successful if this is your objective. So for this kind of tactic, you could use something like influencers, which if used correctly can have a huge amount of time spent with the users. You can, of course, also be one of the brands that are really good at social media, where you can also potentially get people to watch many minutes of your video, or you can use a format like the TrueView format, which is essentially the same, again, where if you do it correctly or well, people can spend a lot of time with your brand. Moving further along into what we call the remind tactic. This is where you just need to keep reminding people about who you are. So from a Danish perspective, this could be where you would have Tuborg Julebryg. You don't need more than just a few drops of snow, and then immediately people will know this is Tuborg Julebryg. If we're talking about a UK example, it could be the biggest tea producer in UK, and now I've forgotten the name. I'm sorry about that, Dan, but I'm sure you know what I mean. It could be the Coca-Cola Christmas ad or whatever. This is the category where you just need a tiny piece of the screen for a short amount of time, and then people will instantly know what it is. So in this category, you can use a lot of social media platforms, in general, a lot of different digital media, or something like TV sponsorships. So the last category, we call that trigger. This is basically where you want to push people over the line. So this is people who've already shown an interest in your product or are already aware of it. So in this category, you would put all kinds of retargeting. You would put Google search. You would put whatever type of platform where you can have some data to decide who you actually want to target, so that you're sure you reach people who have shown some kind of interest. So I think one thing that's important to say is, obviously you can't look at this in isolation and only do one thing. You can, of course, do some sort of brand building and do some sort of follow-up activation. You can, of course, also use these different platforms that I've mentioned as examples for different things. I'm not saying you can't use any sort of Google or Facebook to do a huge impact campaign. I'm not saying you can't use TV to drive actual sales. Of course you can. I just put some examples on it to show you, like, when is it most important to have the audio-visual experience, and when do you just need a smaller portion of a smaller screen in general.
Thank you, Christopher. I think just to round up, one of the most important aspects here is the fact that you have to think about how your brand is, and be a bit tough on yourself, and look in the mirror and say, okay, this is actually where I'm at. And to just kind of like make it stick a bit, we made a small poll here where you can kind of see yourself in the different areas. So just think about your brand, like, how is it? Where does it fit in? What kind of communication and advertisement should you be doing right now? And while we do that, I'm just gonna look if there's any questions here from the audience. I guess it doesn't look like that, but I don't know if any of you have any small questions that you want to ask.
Christopher, I've actually got a question. A lot of people say that brand building can't be achieved typically with digital media.
Mm-hmm.
What's your take on that?
Well, I think to some extent, I probably agree. Well, I think it's a too simplistic view, because of course you can use digital media for brand building. But I also think that there is a reason that as brands grow bigger and as they expand, you see them going on TV. You see these direct-to-consumer brands, as they grow big enough, they also start to use offline media, because they understand that it has some other, it can do some other things that digital media can't. What I would then say is that if you prime people correctly on TV or cinema or whatever, you can definitely use a lot of online media to really reinforce that connection that you're creating with the user. And I will also say, of course, digital media is expanding, and you have many more ways of making sure that people spend time with you, that they actually see it, that they have the sound turned on. So I think in a way it's a bit too simplistic, but I also understand the point that there is a difference, and we know that it's important to create an emotional connection if people need to remember you, and for that, that's just easier to do if people have sound turned on and are paying attention to what you're showing them.
Right, yeah.
Perfect. Dan, I actually think this is a perfect road to the next principle. I don't know if you want to present that.
I'll get cracking. So the next principle is about choosing the right media, combination. I mean, the first thing is, well, why should we use a combination of media in the first place? Why can't we just focus on one media? Well, there's actually quite a lot of evidence now that using a multi-channel campaign gives you a better return on your investment. So this data, for example, from the Journal of Advertising Research, shows that campaigns that have 5 media platforms are 35%, achieve 35% greater ROI than campaigns that just use one channel. And I've seen this again with my time back in Kantar, this pattern, exactly the same pattern as this. And I think one of the key reasons for this actually is to do with what we know from Professor Byron Sharp, which essentially is that you get a better ROI if lots of people see your advertising a few times than if a few people see your advertising lots of times. And there's a risk, let me just move on. There's a risk that if you only use one channel, so for example, a brand that uses the low reach channel in red on this diagram, that you'll hit that point of diminishing returns quite quickly, where you're hitting the same people too many times and it's not making much impact, additional impact. So the brand here would do better before it reaches that point of X, the point of diminished returns. At that level of spend, the brand should incorporate other media, for example, the high reach channel, even though the high reach channel wouldn't have been as effective for the brand at very low levels of spend, as you can see from the graph here. There's another very important reason why using more than one channel is highly effective. And that's because certain combinations of channels work really, really well together to achieve the end goal, which is sales. The way I think about it, it's like you've got certain types of advertising that helps to build the brand. Yeah, we just talked about that. For example, YouTube Unskippable is using increasingly, and obviously TV and cinema. And a lot of people call that, of course, brand development. And the goal of brand development advertising is to get the ball in the vicinity of the goal. And then it's up to other small sales activation channels. So advertising that can be placed much closer to the decision moment, the category decision moment, that the role of that advertising is to head it into the net and achieve the sale. Now, in terms of ratio, there's been a lot of work on, what's the right combination in terms of spend across these two. So there's an excellent paper called The Long and the Short of It. I highly recommend. And the conclusion from that paper was that the optimum mix would be of spend would be 60-40 in favor of brand building. But of course, that is just an average, and a lot will depend on actually how strong your creative is in achieving, in these two types of advertising mechanism, and also, of course, what the priority is for your business. So is it to achieve sales right now, in which case you might want to cash in and use lots of sales activation, but that might not build your brand, your long-term underlying brand, and therefore sales, whereas brand building advertising might not give you that quick, big sales return, but in the long term can give you a much, much bigger return and a sustainable profit into the future. So it's that short-term, long-term divide that's important.
Yeah, you know what, Dan? I think one thing that's important about this this paper and this graph that you just showed is that it actually also applies to B2B. And I think that's a place where we often see that perhaps 90% or even 100% of the budget is spent on what you would call sales activation, what could be lead generation or some sort of demand generation. And what it actually shows is that in these categories, in B2B, it's almost equally important to have a strong brand. So the split is reverse according to the research, but you would still need to spend almost half your budget, on a general level, on what we would call brand building. But another thing I think is quite important, and one reason why I think many people end up spending more on what you call sales activation, at least in B2B, is that people are very focused on, sales. And I read a quite interesting article by Jenny Romaniuk, who's the other one from How Brands Grow, not Byron Sharp, but he actually had a co-author. And what she says is that perhaps one of the reasons we often get it wrong is that we call it brand building. Perhaps if we called it short-term sales and long-term sales, perhaps that would be a better explanation of what it is we actually try to achieve. Because when we do brand building, we do it to achieve sales in the long term. And what it will help us do is increase our conversion rates, make us more famous so that we get more engagement, so that we can reach more people for a smaller budget, or for the same budget, reach more people. So I think that there is something quite interesting in how we talk about brand building, because we often make it as something a bit I don't know if I can call it soft, and it's really a big part of what helps you actually sell.
Also build on that, of course, there's also plenty of good evidence that building a strong brand can also help you support higher prices. So it has another financial impact beyond pure sales, whereas activation advertising often doesn't. You're more just using your equity rather than building it for the future.
Perfect then. So I'm just going to run a poll for how people are actually utilizing their budgets right now. So are you using it mostly on branding or on sales activation? So I'm just going to start that right now. And while people are answering this, we had 2 questions coming in. So the first one was for you, Christopher, and it's Alexander. He's asking you, what would be the main drivers of marketing ROI in high traffic e-commerce business?
I think that's a good question, and I think it's hard to answer in a very generalized way, because the correct answer would probably be it depends on a lot of things that I don't know at the moment. What I would say is that when you are talking about creating ROI in an e-commerce world, I'm just initially thinking that you're probably measuring in a quite short-term way what this campaign is driving right now. And if that's the case, I would argue that you would need to continue testing and see what drives the best return. I would expect that some of the usual combinations, which would be some kind of awareness thing, which could be TV or some form of online video that creates a lot of attention and the people actually sees, and then follow that up quite heavily with whether that's Facebook and Google in combination, or whatever type of activity you can do that would put the ball in the goal. I would say, I don't know if there was a good enough answer, but I think it's really hard to say just like that. But I've seen in the past a lot of e-commerce shops be quite surprised about what you can do with just TV or online video, Facebook and Google.
No, I think it's a very good answer. I think you would need to do some kind of market analysis and understand what is actually going on. I had another question then. It's from Claudia, and she writes here, in times of a crisis, I think many companies turn up the media spend on sales rather than brand building. What's your take on building a brand through a low on no brand budget?
Right, yeah, no, Claudia's absolutely right. This does happen a lot. I think there's a couple of things to think about. I mean, one is it may be a necessity. It may be the brand and the company had no option but to do it. Like if Kristen, you just flick back to the slide I showed earlier, if you need to increase sales for whatever reason to keep afloat, then actually sales activation is probably what you would need to do in the short term. But there is, again, very strong evidence that in the longer term, that will really damage your profitability. So you're actually eroding by stopping your brand building. You will slowly erode that. In fact, if you stay on, by the way, Claudia, after the end of this webinar, we'll keep it open. I'll show you one of the slides in my backup deck, which illustrates what happens to a brand if it just takes 1 year out, and how long it takes to get its base, and how much more it costs afterwards to get back to that point. It's quite startling. I mean, actually, Christian would kill me if I try and hold this up to the. I'm going to try anyway, but it's not focusing. I won't do it, but I'll show you later. So in the long run, if the company can afford it, actually, there's evidence that it should put more into brand building than activation at times of crisis. But it's only if you can afford it.
Yeah, but I actually think we watched a webinar from Facebook earlier or just in the end of last year, and they were even pushing for maybe 80 or 90% into brand building and 10% into activation. Dan, and actually also Christopher, but I think Dan, I'll let you go for this first. What is the best balance, sales and brand building for a small startup with a small media budget?
That's a good question. I think early on in the life stage of your brand, well, I wouldn't say the balance is necessarily between sales and activation, brand building and activation, but it certainly is in terms of focusing more on, let's call it the basics early on for your startup. I've always said that with launch advertising, you need to tell people what your name is, what you do, just the basics, what you're good at. And it tends to be, you need to say more, focus a little bit more on the rational until people just know what you are. You can't go straight in with some high concept brand building advertising if people don't even know your brand. It's not credible, and that's not the way brand building tends to work. So I think there's a definite transition over time. And actually, can I do a plug for my book? Oh, this would be even better. Again, it's in one of these, but showing how at different stages of a brand, the communication emphasis evolves. It evolves over time, starting with more factual and then moving on later, like you say, to the much more brand building, which things like, we know that Amazon are doing that now, aren't they? It's like they now spend a huge amount on very brand building advertising on TV. Whereas years ago, they would never have done that because everyone knows what Amazon is all about now. Early on, it was much more, telling the facts of and reassuring people about security of buying online, which was a big concern back in the day. So much more functional messaging.
Thank you, Dan. Christopher, do you have any small things to add here?
No, I think I can do this really shortly. I would just say that if you are the category leader, you, according to the research, can afford, you should spend a bigger part of your budget on long-term selling or brand building or reinforcing your brand. Whereas if you are the challenger or a small brand, you would probably do wise to spend a bit more on the more rational sales activation stuff that Dan already mentioned.
Okay. So we talked a bit about this poll and how people would actually answer it. And I'm quite surprised that we have a tie between the 25% brand and 75% sales activation and the other way around. So
I got it wrong, didn't I, Christian? Yeah, okay.
That's pretty new to me. Anyways, Dan, I think we are ready for the next part. I'll just let you introduce that.
Okay, Yep, so we're now on the third and the final of the three principles, and this one is optimizing your creative in different media. And I think the reason that this is so important is the importance that creative quality plays in advertising effectiveness and ROI. So again, if you want to read more about this, look up Advertising's Greatest Hits, a paper by Paul Dyson, which illustrates what the big variables are in terms of ROI from advertising. And beyond brand size, which came out number one, actually the creative quality was the second biggest variable, more than lots of variables, including how well your targeting was achieved, etc. So creative quality, it's your magnifier of your creative budget. So how do you optimize that? Well, one way of doing it is using market research. So I spent many years in market research originally, and research can be used badly, but it can be used very, very well to help you improve advertising. And I always like to think of using it in this way, as shown here. So you need to basically check three things. You need to check, did people understand your advertising as you intended to do? Do they get it? Because quite often it can be difficult for people to realize what you're doing, and if they don't really understand it, they switch off. Okay. Assuming it's understood, or it can be clarified somehow, you can make changes to make it clearer what's going on or whatever, then the most important thing next is, okay, are people enthusiastic about what they've experienced in the ad? We know that likability is still the number one best predictor of sales effectiveness. Simply whether people like the advertising is a very good indicator for whether it's going to work. And if they don't like it, and if understood and they don't like it, there's not much you can do. It means you just got a dull idea, and then it always worries me with A/B testing, because with A/B testing, you can tell whether one's better than the other, but they might both be really poor. I think that's a shame. So if they do have your target customer is giving an enthusiastic response, the next thing to check is the brand getting credit for the advertising, for what's in it? Is the brand registered? Is it part of what's going on? And again, that's one of the most common failings of potentially strong advertising, is that the brand isn't properly integrated into what's going on. And again, that can sometimes be solved, not always, but it does mean you've got a chance from research to end up with a much stronger set of ads than you would have done. But one of the things about research is it's all very, you can get a bit of general learning for next time, but to be honest, it can help you optimize, but it's not going to help you necessarily come up with strong ads in the first place. And I think coming up with really strong ads in the first place is harder these days because of the big variability between different channels. They're so different. So this illustration here, this is based on Lumen and TVision's eye tracking data. It shows you the variability in the amount of time that is spent actually looking at ads delivered through different platforms. So ranging from, say, a TV 30 seconds, which on average people look at it for 14 seconds, I believe, yep, through to a lot of the digital advertising shown on the bottom row. Typically, on average, it's between just 1 and 2 seconds is what you've got to deliver your message. But of course, these are just averages. It is possible to create advertising that works really, really well in its media and gets people to pay much more attention, and it really break all those averages, smash those averages, if you see what I mean. So I'm now going to hand back to Christopher to talk about that creative side of things in digital channels.
Thanks a lot, Dan. By the way, I can see that it's almost 1:45 now, so I will try to do this as quickly as I can without missing any important points. I hope you have time to stick around for just perhaps 3 more minutes than what we had intended. Okay, so when you create ads specifically for digital, I'm not going to talk about how you create a great TV ad. I'm going to talk about how do you actually make people stop and watch your ad when they can just skip, for example. So there are 4 questions that I believe are important to ask yourself when you start creating your ads in the digital world. Number 1 is, will people experience the ad with sound on or sound off? Or at least what's the most common thing on the platforms that you're going to deliver the ads on? Number 2, are people forced to view it, or can they just skip whenever they want to? That has quite a big impact on the way you structure the ad, whether it's a classical build-up or whether it's the reverse. Number 3, will the ad that you're creating fit the platforms that it's going to be live on? I saw a comment from the audience about Twitch, for example. You would never run a regular, Instagram ad on Twitch. That would just be really weird and really off for all the users on Twitch who are used to something very, very different. And number 4, what is the average screen size that people will watch the ad on? Is it something they will watch on their mobile? Is it something they will watch on a desktop? Is it something that they will watch in a vertical way or the other way? Or is it even something they will watch on a much bigger screen, such as something that they would stream onto a TV screen? So I will just show you a few examples of ads that I believe are doing really well or are thinking about these things in the right way. So moving on to the first example, this is an ad that is shown without sound, or at least can be shown without sound. I'll just let it play for a few seconds and then talk about it for a while. And of course, it's not necessarily very interesting to see something without sound, but what I do think that this ad achieves quite well is there is a quite dramatic opening that creates some suspense in terms of what's actually going to happen here. I think the text it's quite big and quite clear what's happening. I think it's relatable in that sense. And actually the product is in focus from the first second to, for 1 minute, basically, you're just seeing a super slow motion of the product. However, this ad works even better if you have the sound on. Yeah, I think you can feel it. It really enhances the experience that you have with it. And I think this is a really good example of something that's created and that works well with or without sound. Moving on to the second thing, which is an example of how you can really play with the functions on YouTube. So this is a perhaps quite famous TrueView ad, which is an ad that users can skip after 5 seconds. So the important thing here is for advertisers to try and make people stick for as long as possible. So let me just play the first 20 seconds.
Vi kan hoppa över den här annonsen nu.
Yeah, we don't have to watch all of it. It's 8-9 minutes long.
Okay, we've got time.
Yeah, I think what it does nicely is that it intrigues people to stay and to see what's actually going to happen. And I think they draw it out so long so that you continue watching and you're like, okay, but something is going to happen. At the same time, it's quite heavily branded. I mean, the very first thing you see is a huge IKEA logo and where life happens message. So I think they nail that quite well in terms of making people stay while still making sure that everyone knows that this is IKEA. And then they also throw in a few product references along the video. Moving on to the next example. This is a more, I don't know, down-to-earth example. You can call it that, or you can even say a sort of an everyday example. But I don't want to call it an everyday example because I don't want to entice people to just post stuff every day that isn't necessarily helpful for their brand. But what I do think that as a short video like this does well is that it has some quite clear Oreo branding. I think we can all see without an Oreo logo that this is Oreo. I think it shows off the brand's personality quite well, that it's quite fun and quite young in that Oreo sense. And it's also easily digestible in the sense that it's something you can scroll past and then you'll get the right experience from Oreo, but you don't need to spend a lot of time. It's not a huge brand campaign like that.
Christopher, I think it's a really good example actually how a short social advert can actually reinforce and strengthen a brand, the brand positioning, the brand image, if you've got an established brand like Oreo, like you were saying earlier.
Yeah, sure. Just one more example in terms of what I mean when I talk about platform fit. So if we are talking about Instagram and Instagram stories, that's often a quite foodie universe, or it could be. I don't know if this is a bit of a masculine take on a foodie universe. Perhaps it could have been a better example than this. But of course, it's also about trying to use the platforms in the way that users normally use it, which could be talking about food, or it could be using some of the using stickers for Instagram stories, doing something that's a bit more custom in the sense that makes people stick just for a little while longer, or makes them do whatever you want them to do. So when you create these ads, try and of course tap into the cultural fit of the platform. This would have looked very different on Twitch, as I already mentioned earlier, and perhaps also try and play around with some of the innovative things that you can do on these platforms. It could have been an AR thing on Snapchat as well. I mean, there are tons of different ways you can be creative. And of course, you can't do that all the time, but I still think that that's also what grabs the user's attention to a larger degree. And of course, another thing that's important, this is not new, but this is I'm just showing you the same example in two different, in vertical and horizontal. I'm not going to defend what the actual ad is, because it's perhaps a bit sexist in a way, or simplistic, but it's just to show you that if you just turn it around the right way, you can actually get, I mean, the ad on the left is 3 times the size the ad on the right. And why would you ever not use the full screen if the objective is to catch people's attention? You would always do that. So I think this is something that I think people are getting better at, but it's still just do it whenever you can if you are going to do something that people will watch on a mobile, because that's basically how they watch it in most places, at least. Unless, I don't know what your audience is. It could also be people that reverse their phone like that, but most people won't do that. All right, so moving on to my very last point, which is a bit different than the others, but I'm just showing you what you can actually also achieve with, for example, YouTube. Now we're actually at the point where, if you look at the gray bar up here, in the US, more than 1/3 of all YouTube views are watched on a TV screen, which means that now you have the option of creating a TV ad with the data that you have from the digital world, where you can use an email list or do some remarketing or whatever you want to do, or just do a proper broad campaign. And I think as more and more of these traditional media platforms are going to be digital, the ways that we in the digital world can show off our ads in a traditional way, where you have a huge screen and sound on, that I think that in that sense, from that perspective, at least, the future is bright for digital ads. Perhaps not so much in a privacy way, but in this way, at least, I think this is something that would be that's going to be great for the effectiveness of digital ads.
Thank you, Christopher. I think, if there's any questions from the audience, please do throw them in now. I know we are a little bit late, but it was great that Dan actually made it, so we could get things going. I also just want to throw something in there. So we've done a lot of brand building here, but we also want to do a little bit of shameless sales activation. So I really want to point out that the Smart Marketing book is a really nice book, and that you should go to your local bookshop or to Amazon and find a copy. I don't know if you have 2 words to put on it, Dan.
Yeah, I would recommend going to Amazon rather than your local bookshop because you're more likely to find it.
Okay, that's good.
And all the bookshops just get closed at the moment in the UK. So anyway, but yeah. No,
that's good. That's good.
Thanks for plugging it. Yeah.
Also, just want to say that we're going to share the slides and a recording of the webinar if there's something that you just want to go back to and jump into. But it doesn't look like there's any questions, so I'm just going to wrap it up here. Thank you so much for joining in, and hope to see you another time. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Christian, are you going to keep it open for a bit in case people want to,
Yeah, I can do that. Should we? You had a small thing you wanted to share, right?
Yeah, because the one I referenced earlier, it's Are you seeing my screen now? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it was Claudia, wasn't it? I just love this example because it's based on a really good and accurate model of sales produced by a D2D company, very, very good at this. And it basically modeled, the black line you can see here is what would have happened if this brand had continued to spend every year on advertising, which it had done for a long time. Okay, spend on advertising, and then it modeled what would happen if they took a year off. They were considering, saving some money, for a year. And interestingly enough, obviously sales in that year drift down, and then obviously they come back up when they return to advertising the year after. But you can see it takes nearly 5 years for the sales to recover to the same level. And in terms of profitability, in that first year, that they saved a bit of money. So the money they saved on advertising, was slightly more than what they lost from sales, but not much. So they hardly gained even in the first year. And in fact, it cost them an extra £1.7 million to get back to where they were. That's the cost of taking a year off, the waste, if you like. And I think this is not uncommon for established brands that routinely spend. Going dark is a big, big risk, especially in a competitive market. So, and then, especially brand building advertising. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. That's perfect.
And I was just going to say, I do have another 12 or 13 slides that didn't quite make the cut for the webinar. So we could have gone on for hours. So if anyone wants copies of these or to chat through them, I'm happy to share these as well if you want. So.
Perfect. Thank you, Dan. Well, I'm going to end it here. But thank you, both of you, and talk to you soon. Bye.
You too.